Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, we're going to talk about Patreon. I already filmed this video once, but it was rather sad and morose, because it's about money, and about the situation of money, which is always a depressing subject when it is not coming in. So, Patreon, if you have not heard of, if you're on Patreon or you've done anything, if you follow anyone who uses Patreon, you may have heard some complaints that Patreon has changed their fee structure. And there's a lot of confusion as to exactly why they have changed their fee structure. There are some theories why it's happened, but all things considered, it's kind of a catastrophe for some. And there have been other videos about this that are quite informative, but mine will be an absurd length of rambling, and I have a mustache, so mine will be objectively better on some points. So anyway, the situation with Patreon is that originally the way that it worked is you donated $1 and then artists got like 80 cents because Patreon would take 5 cents, and then you would also have your banking fees or whatever. And the banking fees vary depending on who you were working with. Apparently Stripe charged the most. They charge a flat rate of like 35 cents plus 2% or something like that, which you might notice is what Patreon has changed their fee structure to. And then PayPal did like 5% or something like that. And this 5% thing here, the dog cannot be contained, but now she will be outside. Anyway, this 5% thing, it was really harsh on the high-end stuff. So Stripe was really hard on the low end, PayPal was really high on the high end, but it didn't matter because the creators were always the one who paid this fee. So, you know, you'd get your money and then you deduct all the fees, and at the end of the day, $1 became 80 cents, and, higher amounts became whatever they were depending on how much was donated, but, PayPal has a cap of $2, so, there was kind of a limit. And it really wasn't a big deal. I personally didn't care, but there were a lot of creators who view Patreon as a shop for some reason. They think it's a store where people come to buy things. Like, people show up and they say, give me $5 and I'll give you a drawing of a duck having sex with another duck, because this is it's a porn Patreon. Those are some of the most popular ones, and I think actually they don't allow bestiality anymore. But anyway, the point is they would just say, like, all right, give me $5 and I'll give you this picture of the duck. And so people would give $5, but then they would delete their pledge before the month was up, and then that way they got the duck, and then they ran away before they paid $5 for the duck, which was just, in some creators' minds, the most deplorable, inhuman thing to have ever happened in the history of things. So they complained a lot that they wanted a system where you would pay up front so that you couldn't get away with the rewards without paying. The problem here being is that Patreon, in their old system, they would just charge you at the end of the month. And this was important because you donated a certain amount of money. Like, let's suppose you had $100 and you wanted to donate to like 100 different creators. You give each guy $1, and then at the end of the month, they charge you once. They take $100, and then whatever your banking fees are, whatever your transaction fees are, that's deducted from the lump sum. And so with systems like Stripe, which is like 2% plus 35 cents, it becomes kind of negligible on the high scale. And again, the processing fee, it actually winds up being spread out among all the patrons. So if you were donating to a bunch of different patrons, if you were one of those people who was donating to like 100 different patrons, $1 to each patron, then I'm pretty sure that the transaction fee got spread across all 100 patrons and was practically negligible. So everybody must have gotten like $1 minus Patreon's 5%. But, like I say, to make this system work, where you do this shop thing, and this is what Patreon says that they've done, you would have to just charge everyone up front, and then you would not charge everyone at the end of the month, you would just charge them when they pledge. So, this is what Patreon is switching over to, is a system that just charges you when you pledge, and then monthly, every time that like exactly 1 month from when you pledged, they charge you again. And, I guess that whether 31 days or 28 days, it doesn't matter, whatever, they just charge you, it's not a 30-day period, I don't know. So anyway, they charge you up front now. This is what they're switching over to do. And the way that they figured out they're going to make this work is they're just going to bill everyone essentially the Stripe fee, so that if you donate $1 to 100 different artists, every single one of those $1 donations will be hit with a fee of 2.9% plus 35 cents. This comes out to about 38 cents, And of course, you multiply that by 100, and it kind of adds up over time. You get a little bit nickeled and dimed all the way through. Now, initially, everybody thought that Patreon was pulling a fast one on us. They were saying like, oh, you know, like you just got to pay this transaction fee on every single transaction. And everybody knew that Patreon took this lump sum at the end. So there was no way that you were paying this transaction fee 100 times if you donated 100 times. You know, and this applies to per video too. So channels or creators that use this per video thing, like I do, or per post thing, like I've done in the past, they also count. So every time like I make a post, now it'll charge somebody with a fee. Yeah, it all adds up over time, and people thought that it was a money grab. But like I say, it turns out that Patreon, like at first they were just like, creators will make more money, and everyone kind of was doing the math, and they were like, well, not really, because the problem with charging this fee, at least if you look at like $1.38, is that's a 38% rise in cost to the patron, but the creator only gets about like 70% of that money, versus the old system where if somebody paid $1, the creator got like 80 cents. So it was more efficient. The old system was more efficient to pay people, like the money transfer was more efficient. And this new system is fairly inefficient. And like I say, what they're doing is they're charging when you pledge on every single pledge. So this isn't really quite the money-making scheme that people thought it was. But people are still pretty sure that Patreon is going to come away with more revenue from this because they're doing two things. First of all, they're charging this fee. And it's kind of a high fee until you get into like really high bidding tiers, but then it just gets weird. So that means that for a lot of things, for the $1 pledge, which was the most common pledge across all of Patreon, as long as the patron isn't using Stripe or one of those other like high expense programs, then Patreon makes a profit because they charge you 35 cents, even though your bank may charge a much lower transaction fee than that. You know, maybe your banks don't like this $1 thing, but whatever, they don't charge you very much. A lot of banks won't charge you very much. So if you're going right out of your checking account or whatever, Patreon is making a profit every time they slap you with this surcharge. So people have noticed that Patreon is still probably going to make a profit on this change, just not as substantial of one as we initially thought, because they're switching over to a more ridiculous system. But also, because they take 5%, if they... actually, never mind. They always took 5%. They always took 5% from the gross. They never took it from the profit. They took 5% from the gross. So nothing changes with their 5%. That remains the same. So yeah. So this whole thing, this fee thing, is just kind of weird. They might still generate some money, but the point is that Patreon CEO and Patreon itself insists that this isn't going to generate more money for them. That this is not a move to do that, and the whole thing really is just about making Patreon a shop for the very foolish creators who thought that Patreon was a shop, you know. And again, like I say, I don't feel like it was a shop. You don't go to Patreon, you don't give them $1, and then you get like a poster. There's no physical media, it's all just digital. And this whole concept, I think, of trying to protect your digital goods on Patreon is a little bit inane. Because even if you do that, even if you force people to pay like $1 to get some kind of art print or whatever, to get an art thing, with the digital goods, they can still just copy that and then upload it to somewhere else at any time. It doesn't matter whether they paid or not, and if you feel like that devalues your work, then, you know, it devalues your work. You know, if you look at this guy paying the bare minimum to get that thing, then, you know, how is that? Like, okay, so you got $5 versus you got nothing. Like, $5 is just $5. The real important thing is having lots of people that are supporting you, or having some people who are supporting you really hardcore with really big donations. You know, that's the point. It's more like panhandling, in my opinion, than it is like a shop. You're basically playing out on the streets, in this case the street being the internet, which has a very high traffic, very high population, and as people walk by you, they say, "Oh, that's cool," and they throw $1 in your hat. You know, that's Patreon. You can't, as a panhandler, go to like the town square, you know, go to I think Times Square you need a permit. But I think I remember like London seeing a lot of these people. Anyway, you can't just go to a populated place in a city and then like put out a sign that says "will not juggle." Like everyone in the area, please leave unless you pay me $5. Like you can't essentially charge admission to a panhandling event. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this idea that there's you know, Patreon should be like a concert, you know, there should be a charge for admission. It's a little silly, and it's not really what the system is about. And again, people can just kind of steal from you. In fact, I had one person. I feel like there's not even really that many bad actors. This is the other thing: is that you get these Patreon these creators who are just caterwauling about like, oh, people are stealing from me, people are reposting my stuff, and I don't think that there are actually that many bad actors on the platform. I've had about 200, close to 300 supporters, and so far I've only had one person that, to my knowledge, has reposted stuff that I've made Patreon exclusive for a while. It was a guy who later on, really, I mean, he was kind of a dick, but he later on, we'll get to this, but the point is that, you know, he was one of my like $1 supporters or whatever, and I would upload this stuff to the Mentally Advanced series to Patreon a week early. And, you know, whenever I'd post it, I would just say, like, feel free to share this with whoever you want. Like, if you want your friends to see it, or you have some, like, social group that you're part of, you can post it there. I don't care. It doesn't matter. The link is for you to share as you please, but then after 1 week, it's going to go public. So what this guy would do is that he would immediately just take it off to 4chan. You know, and I didn't really care all that much that he took it off to 4chan because, you know, I have the same opinion that, like, you really can't protect your digital goods. You know, they're for the public, and the point of Patreon is not to create a gate, it's just to continue doing what you're doing. People throw money in the hat, and you say, like, thanks, you know, I survived till tomorrow. I'll do it again tomorrow. I'll do another thing tomorrow. And that's the point. So I wasn't really very mad at him, but, you know, he gave this kind of like, he got up on his high horse about it, and he was like, listen, like, I'm really helping Greg by posting this stuff that's supposed to be Patreon exclusive and da-da-da-da-da. And like I say, I didn't care, but other people kind of got on his case about it. They were like, you know, this is supposed to be like a reward kind of thing for donating. You're not really supposed to share it with everybody. And he was like, oh, you know, you're wrong because da-da-da, and I'm so smart and I'm so brilliant. And, you know, he just didn't care. He would post the video every time that it went up. Eventually, I stopped doing the week in advance thing, not because of this guy, but just because it got to where I felt like I was taking so long to get the episodes out that by the time I got them out, I didn't want to wait. Like a lot of times, I'll work really hard in like the last week, or I'll devote pretty much all my time just to this big project to finish it off in the last week. And then if I don't upload it, there'll be nothing to show for that week for the ordinary people. It'll just be like this dead week. And, you know, then the patrons get like a week. And it's not a dead week for the patrons, but it's a dead week for everybody else. And then, you know, it'll be like a month late. It might be late, you know. I don't know. So I just started uploading it because I didn't want to have these sort of like dead weeks, especially on YouTube, which really, really cares about how frequently you're posting. So, you know, if YouTube didn't care so much, if YouTube weren't trying to force you to be constantly active, then I suppose it wouldn't matter, and I could go back to waiting. But it really has more to do with YouTube and just wanting to have stuff online than it does with this particular guy. But yeah, just the one guy I can think of the whole time that I've done things, and otherwise we do backgrounds or desktops or whatever, and then I don't really see those get reposted, and maybe I'm not big enough for that to be a thing. But point is, I feel like there's only so many people who are bad actors in this system because the whole patron system is kind of like, it's about supporting artists that you like voluntarily. You know, that's the point. I suppose it's worse for the people who want the gatekeeping, because they're trying to say, like, well, it's not just a voluntary support, it's mandatory support. And then people say, like, no, it's not. And they turn around and they just, like, you know, spite you. But for my case, it's never been mandatory, and I don't really see people going out of their way to repost stuff. Or, well, it's not really intended to be mandatory, I guess. I guess the desktops are, I don't know. They're private, but whatever. They're not the main thing that I produce. So, yes. Anyway, so I think the whole thing is frivolous and was never really something that needed to be pursued. And a lot of people don't really like this change because it imposes a much higher cost on patrons, which is causing a lot of patrons to leave. I was talking to Pencils, and he lost like 15 people. I've lost like 10 people so far, and doing the math, that's about 5% of my patrons have left my Patreon. I don't know if I don't think 5% of the income has been lost, but you look at it, it's like how many fewer people will donate with these stupid fees, and there's an opportunity cost there. So Patreon, by changing the system, although they say that they're going to get me more money because, you know, I get the 95% instead of the 80%, it's like, well, you know, all right, yeah, I get 95 cents on the dollar instead of 80 cents, but how many people are now not signing up for my Patreon? Because this is the other thing, is that for a while there, things were looking pretty good because I just posted the Nepotism Adventure series. And after I post a project like that, I usually get a bunch more people who come in. They donate. And so that's kind of where my bumps are, is I kind of go along and I have like, oh, here's a bump, and then a bunch of people donate. And it's good that way. But this time, it's just a fall. So like I kind of had my fall and it started to climb, and then Patreon announced that they were going to mess with the fees, and now it's a free fall. And so at the end of January, at the end of the month, you always find that people drop off the face of the earth and they leave the Patreon, so you have this big cliff. And so I'm just like falling in December. I'm not like recovering up to where I was. Like I fell in December, started to recover, the change was announced, now I'm back down at the bottom. And then come January, it's going to fall again. And I'm going to wind up with less than I had before. And then January is when I think the whole fee thing starts to really kick in site-wide. And I'm going to lose more people, I'm pretty sure, because they're going to realize what the fees are doing and they're going to be upset. And then, maybe February, March is when things will stabilize. And so it's going to be a couple of months of uncertainty and weirdness. So anticipating that fewer people will donate because of the fees, and that people are leaving, and I've lost, like I say, like 5% of my patrons. This paltry little extra 5 or 10 cents that I'm getting because of this change, it's not really worth it. And Patreon has admitted that they understand it's not really worth it. They admit that this is a difficult thing, but they say they're committed to this change. And so the big question is, why would this be? And one reason that people are throwing out there is because Patreon is a big venture capital sort of thing. What that is this is like a little tech startup, and there are these venture capitalists that invest into tech startups because they're hoping that they'll be the next Facebook. So they put in millions and millions of dollars into this, and it was this huge bubble because you were seeing things like YouTube and Facebook and whatever, Google, and they were all getting just enormous. But the bottom dropped out rather suddenly, I think because venture capitalists suddenly realized that Google and Facebook and Twitter and these other things that got going have already taken over the internet, and because they're monopolies and they're so powerful, they've really stopped growth on the internet. People aren't really innovating anymore, because if you ever try to do anything, you're stuck in Google's ecosystem, or you're stuck in Facebook's ecosystem, or whatever. You're in someone else's ecosystem, and you can only grow if Google wants you to grow, at which point, I guess they just buy you out, or whatever. So it's not really like it's not really a healthy system for innovation anymore. And so very few things are really taking off. They're all just kind of stagnating and failing because they can't compete with Google or whatever. So like, for example, VidMe was a great example. VidMe was a venture capital startup that went for a while. They had lots of investors, and the investment money kept them alive for quite a while. But the trouble was that they never really were able to get anywhere near YouTube, and neither has any other video site. Any kind of social media thing, it's going to be defeated by Facebook and Twitter, maybe even Tumblr. I don't know. These big websites that are there, they kind of just dominate. So Patreon, they're making a nice profit, I think it's profit of $7 million a year. But they're also a venture capital startup, and what that means is that they are disgustingly overvalued. Although the company makes $7 million in profit, and they have about 80 employees, which means that they could theoretically pay all of their employees $800,000, or like say if this is profit, then it could be even, I have no idea how much they're making, but they have that much money just sitting around. If that's income, still, I guess you could just pay. There's not that much overhead with Patreon. But anyway, $7 million a year, not bad. But the problem is that the venture capital investors have put like over $100 million into Patreon, and they expect a return. So, again, Patreon denies that this move is to satisfy investors, but they could very well be lying because, it would be really terrible if they were just like, we're just kind of pumping everyone, we're gouging everybody to make money for our investors who have grossly overvalued us, and they're demanding to know where their money is, and they'll shut us down unless we cooperate with them. The whole thing, they have this sort of board of directors, thing going on. And this is just something like, I feel like this is what the economy is like now, is that everything is kind of starting to become they're becoming these monopolies, these too big to fail situations. We're just like deregulating everything, so there's no control and no oversight, and everything's just getting so big. And so you kind of look around, you say like, well, what's the video service? Like YouTube, there's one video service. There's just this monopoly. There's no regulation on it, really. There's no controls. There's nothing. So they just do kind of whatever they want to do, and they want to make profit. So they changed their entire website to focus on these just completely inane criteria, and they wiped out all the creativity, or most of the creativity on their platform, and replaced it with Elsa Spider-Man. Because Elsa Spider-Man posted frequently. It was some of the most successful Elsa Spider-Man channels were actually created by machines. This is really amazing. It's actually quite ingenious. Some of the Elsa Spider-Man videos, what they did is they just took like mocap video, pre-generated mocap, and a bot would just create a cartoon with this pre-generated mocap, and then the bot would name the episode something that was very SEO friendly, Spider-Man buried alive, syringe, pregnancy, whatever, and it would link it to all the other Spider-Man Elsa videos. And they were actually spamming this. There would be like multiple channels with a bot uploading videos to each channel, and all these channels were claimed by like an MCN, and then everything was put into Content ID. So it was a whole scheme. It was just this massive thing, and they were getting millions and millions and millions of views. They were potentially botting views to get this, to get the promotional algorithm to pay attention to them. But the point is that they were doing exactly what YouTube wanted, which was producing lots and lots of content to run lots and lots of ads. And the only problem here, I'm sure, as far as YouTube was concerned, was that they were exploiting kids, which looks really bad. So when advertisers started to pull out, suddenly YouTube was like, oh, these videos? Yeah, man, that's pretty bad. We ought to do something about these. And then they turned around and they started to delete them all. But until then, they were making a fortune on these videos, so they just kind of let them be. So anyway, though, so YouTube, it's a big monopoly. They just kind of turn around and they just look at like, well, what's going to make us the most amount of money? And they don't have to worry about ethics or competitors. They don't have to care if they drive creativity off their platform. They really don't care because they're huge. And if YouTube were to fail, there essentially wouldn't be a video service anymore. You'd still have like Dailymotion or whatever, but those aren't really popular platforms. Everybody would have to find a new place to go watch video. They're too big to fail in a lot of ways, and I kind of wonder what would happen, like if Google ever finally just decided like, well, we're going to shut down YouTube. Lots of people would I don't know. I just don't know what they would do. But yeah. The problem with all this stuff, though, is that it creates a lot of volatility because you have all this like investment, this huge top-heavy investment and all this like monopoly type stuff. And they do these things and they price gouge and they price gouge and they price gouge. And you get what's called the broken window fallacy, or not the broken window fallacy, but it's a broken window situation where essentially they're going around and they're throwing rocks through windows and saying like, okay, so now you got to pay us to fix the window. They're creating these situations where you're kind of forced to pay, or you're forced to play their little games so that they can make more money, and it's draining. It prevents you from doing other things. Investing your time and resources into fixing all these stupid windows means that you're not really producing other things. You're not being productive. And so that means that you can't go out and buy new shoes. You can't go out and you can't buy like cake or, beef or whatever. You can't buy a Cadillac, whatever politicians are saying that poor people are wasting their money on. You don't have money to waste money on it. And so you start to get kind of a depression, and your economic system sort of collapses. The whole system sort of implodes, and then they've got to start over. And so we're seeing this with like the adpocalypse, as they built all this crap up where they were like, just make as many videos as you can, as long as possible, about some SEO friendly thing. And then people started doing that, and then it turned out to be really horrible for advertisers, and so advertisers pulled out because they were just throwing money away. It was going into an insane black hole. So Patreon, if they are suffering this venture capital thing, I fear that in the coming years we're going to watch them start breaking windows and asking us to pay for repairs. They're going to say like, well, we just got to keep these lights on. It's really tough running a website with like zero oversight. And we need you to pay more money. We just, now we need a 10% cut, and we're gonna have these fees. In fact, we're gonna raise the fees. You know what? We're gonna actually make you subscribe now. Creators have to subscribe and pay us a flat fee on top of their 5% cut, and so on and so forth. And they'll just keep adding on little things to make more money, so that their investors will be happy. And every year, the investors will ask, why am I not making more money? And so they'll have to come up with another thing. And because they're a monopoly and they're not regulated, there's really nothing preventing them from doing this, they can do whatever they want. Everyone's kind of captive. Now, here's the thing that's weird, though, is a lot of people kind of look into, like, how do these monopolies get to be monopolies? And part of it is, again, because these businesses get to be so huge. They're very powerful, like these. Patreon got tons of money from venture capitalists, and the venture capitalist funding is part of what made all of this possible. Without all this money flying into the system, they never could have come to exist in the first place. And so it's good initially that this happened, but only in the short term. What happened with Patreon? I've read the theory is that potentially they got into this whole thing and they got really big without ever really clarifying exactly what kind of company they are as far as their financial services went. Because if you hold money, if you're like a sort of a company that holds money in an account and then you distribute that money based on the request of your clients, then you're more like a bank. You're more like PayPal or whatever. And there's a lot of different regulation and rules on what you can and cannot do as a bank. So if Patreon, like a lot of people were saying, like, well, if we want to do this stupid gatekeeping thing, if we want to turn Patreon into a shop where you have to buy video, then why don't we just like have you take our money, like I'll give you $20, and then you give me Patreon tokens, each Patreon token is worth $1, and I'll just donate to whoever I want. And at the end of the month, you take the money out of my account and you give it to these other guys. Well, they can't do that because it'll change the type of business that they are. They become more like a bank. They're storing money and then distributing money. And so then they're overseen by all these regulatory agencies and there are all these rules and what have you. So Patreon, I think they don't want to become this money-holding company. They want to remain Patreon. And the thing that might be coming to light is that since they're growing and since they're getting bigger, it might be that regulators are kind of looking at Patreon and they're saying, what kind of business are you? Like, they might make the argument that Patreon, because they take money, even though they very briefly hold the money, they're handing it out to a bunch of different people. So it's not one transaction, one sale. It's, they're taking $10 and then distributing it out to, anywhere between 1 and 10 people. So they could say, like, well, even though you're only briefly holding the money, you're still holding the money and then redistributing it. So this makes you essentially like a bank, and now you're subject to all these regulations that have to do with the bank. So again, like I say, the theory goes, and Patreon hasn't said anything about this, so it's just a theory. The theory goes that Patreon is switching over to this pay as you pledge system, because if they do that, you donate $1, and then the dollar goes straight to whoever you donated to. At this point, Patreon's not holding your money. They're not a money holding company. They're just passing the money on through. So essentially you're just being charged for this one donation that you make. And then this way, they don't have to follow all the rules that a bank has to follow. They're not overseen by these regulatory agencies, and they can kind of continue to function in a way that's more streamlined and cheaper for them. So they may be saving costs in a very behind the scenes kind of way that makes a little bit more sense only if you know the law. And unfortunately, I don't know enough about these laws that I could really go in depth about it. Like I say, that's the article. I read an article that explained that, potentially that's the line of thinking that they might be going down. So, yes. As to the future of Patreon and how things are going to go, I don't really know. I know that I would not personally be able to survive without Patreon. So if Patreon starts to spiral the drain, I may have to find new work. Currently, most of the people who have left the Patreon, they were people donating like $1 or less. I had people who were still grandfathered in from the old days when you could donate less than $1, who were donating, like 25 cents, 50 cents, whatever, per video. And a couple of them left, and a couple of dollar guys left. One person who was giving $3 left, and that's too bad because that was a little bit, $3 is a little bit more substantial. But yeah, people are leaving, and I expect more people to leave, and it's a very anxious time. Um, but I know that other people have kind of pitched in, and they're providing a little bit more support in the hopes that I don't vanish and that things wind up okay. Um, so yes, there's not really a whole lot more that can be said about Patreon, but just this is kind of the weird system that they're going through. This is what they're trying to accomplish, I guess. They're just trying to get away from regulation, and they're trying to make a little bit more money for their venture capital thing. Like I say, they insist that the venture capital deal has nothing to do with it, but this change did take place not long after like an investor meeting, I think, is what I read. So it seems a little bit disingenuous to say that Patreon didn't make this change after maybe someone in charge of the company financially stepped in and said, "Hey, I want some changes." So yes. Again, like I say, they're kind of a monopoly, and because of this weird regulatory gray area that they operate in, it's hard to say whether or not anyone would come to replace them in the future. There's this new thing coming out called Drip, and I don't really know a whole lot about Drip, but I believe that I read that it works a little differently. I think that it doesn't allow PayPal or Stripe, though, because they have really high fees. PayPal and Stripe are really the killers for fees. PayPal is the one that, they're bad for high amounts, and Stripe is bad for low amounts. So, yes. Will someone else come along that will be the same? Like, I've seen a lot of people switch over to Ko-Fi, or just like I've seen a bunch of other little names pop up for like little like payment systems. But those are similar to PayPal. Like, I have a PayPal, and if you guys just want to like donate money one-off, like some of those systems provide, then you could do that. I mean, PayPal has some high fees, but I used to get donations from people from time to time, just because they like my stuff and they wanted to keep me alive. Again, Patreon getting into this system where you have to pay, you pledge once and you pay a fee. The subscription thing is nice, but PayPal also offered that. So essentially what Patreon is doing is they're getting away from the business model that everybody really liked and everybody really appreciated. They're getting away from the business model that made them popular, so they can get more into a business model that essentially is the same as what PayPal was originally offering. A subscription to just pay someone every month. And this is not necessarily better. I mean, I guess they're like more transparent on Patreon, which is nice, and you kind of get your rewards and whatnot. But if this is what they're going to get into, there's really not anything too competitive that they can offer. This is the other thing, is that I think that if they're trying to get away from the regulatory thing, I've also read the theory that part of why they put all the fees onto the patrons is because they're trying to keep the creators happy. Because if they make the creators pay the fees, then it really is just the same as PayPal. Because whatever, you always paid the fees as the one receiving the money on PayPal. So if they don't push the fees onto the patrons, they're really not very competitive with all the other money options that are out there. So yes. The silver lining, though, is I guess that for whatever reason, the way that they designed their fees, I think if you get into it's either $10 or $20. I've seen different opinions on, it depends on what the actual what your bank is doing and this and that. Apparently, I think if you're doing PayPal and you donate $20, it's actually a loss for Patreon, in theory. I think $10 was weirdly efficient if you go by Patreon's numbers for fees. I think that their fee numbers were questionable, but yeah. There's higher values are actually a loss to Patreon in theory, and it's just strange. The whole thing is just strange. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Hopefully it holds out for a while, but they're a big monopoly. There's no regulation on them, and they may be intentionally trying to avoid regulation. And so just like all the other big monopolies, like YouTube, whatever, the honeymoon is over, and it's may all be kind of headed downhill, which is sad. It feels like we're coming to the end of a big renaissance period. The internet was so big and so bold, and so many cool things were happening on it. So many companies were competing, and there was so much creativity. And to watch that all just go away within a lifetime is quite sad, especially with the way things are just kind of economically in at least the States, if not the world. I don't know. I worry a lot about the future. I am pretty sure we're all gonna die. Everything's on fire. Everything's in flame. Quetzalcoatl's gonna come back and devour the earth. He promised he would, and I believe him, because why would you promise something like that if you didn't mean to get around to it one day? He's just gonna remember. He's gonna be like going to the fridge one day, Quetzalcoatl, his godlike fridge. He's gonna pull out his golden meat of golden lamb, and he's gonna be like, oh shoot, I was gonna destroy the earth, and he'll just drop that lamb there in the fridge and go destroy the planet. It's coming. Everyone's gonna die. Get out your fancy plates and your fancy forks and have a big party, because it'll be something to see. Quetzalcoatl. I've never seen a god before. What an event. So, yeah. Quetzalcoatl. Google will summon him. Google will make an AI that will finally upset Quetzalcoatl enough to get him off his throne. So, yes. Anyway, Patreon, Monopolies, YouTube, the light. I'll keep a close eye on things. We'll see how things turn out. For those of you guys leaving, I'm sad to see you go. I wish that things were different. I'm stressed that it's turned out that way. But for those of you guys sticking it out, I really appreciate it. I know this sucks, and hopefully it'll be okay. I'll think about doing other things. I mean, like, the thing they used to do was merchandise. You'd sell CDs, DVDs, T-shirts, coffee cups. Maybe I'm getting good enough at art. Probably not quite yet. I'll keep trying to get better at art, and then someday I'll start selling funny T-shirts, and then you guys can buy T-shirts, and we'll go back to the old ways. And we'll also barter instead of using currency. And we'll communicate with telegraphs, because apparently the FCC deregulated telegraphs recently. Everything's going insane. The world's gone mad. So that'll be it for today. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll catch you all next time.